Hi, everybody, and welcome to Exegetically Speaking, a podcast of the friends and faculty of Wheaton College, Wheaton, Illinois, and the Lanier Theological Library in Houston, Texas. My name is David Capes, and I am the Senior Research Fellow at the Lanier Theological Library and a former dean up there in Wheaton at the School of Biblical and Theological Studies. Our purpose in these podcasts is really very simple. We want to promote the study of biblical languages, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, so we can read the Bible more faithfully, study it more fully, and not just read it, but to live it.
Hi, I'm Doug Moo. I'm a Wessner Professor of Biblical Studies at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois, where I've served for a little over 20 years now, after serving for over 20 years at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. I also chair the Committee on Bible Translation, the translation team charged with oversight of the New International Version of the Bible.
Hey, Doug, thanks for being with us today on Exegetically Speaking. It's good to see you again.
It's good to see you too, David. Thanks for inviting me.
Even though we're separated by 1,100 miles at this point, still technology makes that possible. We're going to talk today about translation theory and about how people approach translations. Now, you've been a part of the Committee on Biblical Translation for a while now, and you know sort of the ins and outs and how hard a work that is. I've witnessed some of that myself, and to see how painstaking that can be. But let's talk about translation theory. How do you go about approaching a text when you translate? What are the ways in which that can be done?
Sure. As I think has become pretty widely known these days, we often think of translation theory on kind of a spectrum with what we call formal equivalence at one end of that spectrum and dynamic equivalence at the other end. By formal equivalence, we mean that a translator is going to try to keep as much of the structure of the original language as possible. By dynamic equivalence, again, at the other extreme, we mean that the translator is not going to really be concerned about keeping the structure. In other words, they're not going to worry that a Greek noun has to become an English noun, or Hebrew verb has to be an English verb, that you can sort of mix things up a little bit. You can choose whatever expression in English might get the idea of the original text, Hebrew or Greek, and that's again called dynamic equivalence. And you can sort of, and you've probably seen these charts, you can construct a chart, kind of a spectrum again, and plot different contemporary English versions on that chart. Three of the translations I like to work with a great deal, just to kind of simplify things, are the English Standard Version, the New International Version, obviously I'm biased, full disclosure, and the New Living Translation. This gives us three really good, carefully translated modern English Bibles that occupy different parts of the spectrum. The ESV, of course, toward the formal end, NIV sort of in the middle, and the NLT a little bit more toward the dynamic end of things.
So you would put the NIV, the translation you've been working on for a number of years, in kind of the middle between that, between formal equivalence and dynamic equivalence.
Yeah, I think it's kind of tries to, in a sense, get the best of both worlds, hopefully without losing either of them at either end, yeah.
So when we use the word equivalence, there's the idea that in translation, you're sort of decoding, right? That there is like you said, a particular verb equals this particular verb in English, from the donor language to the receptor language. But in fact, it's more complicated than that, isn't it?
It's a lot more complicated, yeah. And if I could sort of bring home one particular point from this podcast,
good.
This is the point I would make that I'm passionate about, that people understand translation doesn't involve a sort of word substitution, mechanical process. I think a lot of people think of translation that way. Well, if you're going to be faithful, if you're going to have a good translation, you find, again, Hebrew noun, you find an equivalent English noun to put in its place. And what you end up with when you do that is gibberish. And the reason for that, of course, is because every language has its own structure. And languages don't share the same structure. So if you try to take the words from one structure and just transfer them into a different structure, you don't end up with a translation at all. You end up with something that's not understandable. In our everyday experience, you can tell someone who's just learning a language when they don't know it very well, because they're kind of sometimes trying to speak in that way, and often very, very difficult to understand.
Mm. So, where would you place the King James Version on that formal to dynamic equivalent spectrum?
It's more toward the formal equivalence, probably. I would put it somewhere between the ESV and the NIV, probably.
Okay. What about the New American Standard Version? It came out, I think, in 72, Lockman Foundation.
Yeah, and just recently revised in 2020 here. It would be a little bit more toward the formal end even than the ESV.
I bet a lot of people out there would have seen the Message. How would you put the Message there? And would that be on the spectrum, or do you consider that more of a paraphrase? And we might need to define what a paraphrase might be.
That's right. Yeah, I kind of avoid the word paraphrase, to be honest, because I think it assumes something about what translation is about that we shouldn't assume. I would put the Message a little further on the dynamic end of the spectrum than the NLT.
Okay. But it's still a translation in that it starts with a language and ends up in another language, right?
That's exactly right. And this is, again, where the language of paraphrase can get us in trouble and obscure more than it clarifies, I think.
Yeah.
People use the word paraphrase, they say, oh, this is a translation of the Bible that's not doing a word-for-word substitution. And again, no translation does a word-for-word substitution because it would be nonsense in English.
Yeah.
And so again, paraphrase is in the eye of the beholder in a sense.
Yeah. There was a woman in the 19th century named Julia Smith who thought, you may be aware of Julia's work, but she thought the King James Version was footloose and fancy-free and just a little bit too much on the dynamic equivalence. But what she ended up with was unreadable. That's why we've never heard of Julia Smith, right? Because when you do these things and you try to be too formal or substitute this word for that, it just, you can't make it understandable in the new language.
One of the ways I like to think about the process, just as someone who's been doing it for a lot of years now, is that a key factor is the kind of English you're aiming for. Mm-hmm. As a rough and ready rule, the more you try to stick to the structure of the original, the more difficult it's going to be to understand in English. Think about the ESV and the NIV and the NLT. And again, I would like to emphasize that these three occupy the kind of middle part of the spectrum. No translation is at extreme ends of formal or dynamic. They're all somewhere bunched in the middle, as it were. But the ESV is quite content, and I think they say this in their publicity, if they can produce a Bible that's understandable English. Mm-hmm. In other words, they value conformity to the structure strongly enough so that as long as they end up with understandable English, they're happy. I think we in the NIV would say, we want to aim more toward natural English, not just understandable, but more readable, easier for people to negotiate. So we're willing to abandon the structures of the Greek and the Hebrew where we think it's needed to produce a natural English rendering. And then the NLT, we could think of as aiming for easy English. And they're willing to move further away from the structures, as it were, the originals, in order to produce a translation that is easy English for people to negotiate. I might just throw in one more point here. As degrees of ability to read decline, I think we all see this in the culture around us. People have less and less ability to read. The literacy levels are going down. I think it becomes all the more important that Bible translators think very seriously about who do I want to be reading my Bible?
Good.
And if you're looking for a broad English-speaking audience, not just perhaps North American English, but people speaking English as a second language from countries in Africa or Asia, there are significant implications for the kind of English you should be aiming for.
That's a great word. Final question. Is a translation ever really done, or is it always being revised?
For the NIV, we're constantly revising. The first NIV full Bible was 1978. The Committee on Bible Translation has met virtually every year since then, making revisions. Sometimes those revisions are the product of new understanding of the Bible. We learn what some words that we didn't know before. We discover something in an archaeological dig that we didn't understand or have evidence for before. And so that enables us to be more accurate. A lot of our time, though, was spent also just on keeping the English up to date. Most translations are involved in this, wanting the Bible to speak to contemporary English speakers so that they can negotiate the word with the fewest possible hindrances. So we spent a lot of time doing that.
Well, that's an important word. Doug, thanks for the work you do on the committee for Bible translation. And thanks for being with us today on Exegetically Speaking.
That's great. Thanks for having me, David.
Thanks to Ian Rosine, Rebecca Larson, and Silvio Vasquez, who helped us produce this podcast. Thanks as well to John Lansma, our Wheaton-based director, who makes this podcast possible. We're grateful to Phil Keggy for our music. If you want to study biblical languages, then you need to consider Wheaton College. Whether you're an undergraduate or a graduate student, we have amazing programs, a first-rate faculty, and some of the best students in the world. So go to the website, www.wheaton.edu, and look for modern and classical languages. Get started today. If you have questions about this or any of our podcasts, we'd love to hear from you. If you have suggestions or questions about any passage in the Hebrew Bible or Greek New Testament, send us an email and we'll see if we can get one of our experts to weigh in on that for you. Our email is exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. That's exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. Thanks for listening.